to another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you, here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, or where you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning into the show and supporting the station. If you have a question or a comment about the show, send an email to comment@am950radio.com. So, this is the time of the year, on last week's show, I was talking about how primary voting is, early voting's out there, and the primaries in Minnesota are on the 11th of August, and there's, other states that are doing this too. Well, this is also the time of the year you'll see over the, the summer and early fall, especially, where there's going to be a lot of polling that comes out. So this particular segment, I'm going to talk about some of the polls that have come out recently and how they're not good for the Republicans. But just because they're not good for the Republicans doesn't mean, the Democrats are going to win and, order will be restored in the midterms. No, that's not the case. As I've said over and over and over on this show, you can't poll voter turnout, right? So even if the polls show, the Democrats are going to, win back the House and all this stuff, doesn't mean it will if the Democrats stay at home again, like they did in 2024. And with the gerrymandering that's going on in the House of Representatives, I mean, that'll give the Republicans even more power if the Democrats just stay at home. Right? So you got to get out there and vote. So, take advantage of early voting if you're not going to be here for the primaries at least. And you will also have that opportunity for the general election where you can early vote if you want. That's something that I do because I'm usually teaching on election night, prior to the polls closing. So I'm going to go through some of these polls, and by the time you hear this show, these numbers are probably going to be a few weeks old, so maybe you'll, see something that's a little bit different than these numbers. But these are the current numbers that I'm doing as of the taping of this show. So let's start out with some polling on one of my names for Trump, Mango Mussolini. Let's start out with some for him. Right, so this is his basically his net job approval numbers, where the polls look at his approval numbers. They also look at his disapproval numbers, and they subtract the disapproval number from the approval number, and then you get your job approval numbers there. So there's been two recent polls by CNBC and the Washington Post. And here are some of those numbers. So for the CNBC one, in April, when they did their last poll, Trump was at negative 18 points. So in other words, his approval rating was negative 18. So he's in the hole. His disapproval number was higher than his approval number. And the latest one that they did here in July is negative 19. So it's even worse. Granted, it's only 1 point, but still, it's not like he gained, a lot or anything. So, but it's negative 19. And Washington Post, on their poll, they had him at minus 25 in April, which for them, their polling, that was a record low for any president in their second term. And then their latest poll is negative 24. So he gained, I guess, if you want to look at it that way, one point, but he's still negative 24 in the Washington Post poll. So that's still bad for him. And that negative 19 for CNBC, that's a record low for them too. So, Trump job approval ratings, at least in these two polls. And I think if you look at, most of the other polls, that they're, similar, where he's underwater. Like his disapproval number is higher, and in some cases a lot higher than his approval ratings. And I happen to think that these numbers are going to get worse for him. because the war is going to drag on. At least, there doesn't seem to be any end in sight as the time I'm taping this show. Also, gas prices have gone up. So I'm taping this show on a Friday. I was out on Wednesday and I went somewhere in the morning and did some stuff, ran some errands, that kind of stuff. And then when I came back home, gas was 20 cents higher a gallon. So it was up to $4.19. Now, by the time you listen to the show, it might be higher than that, but that's at least what the current number is, at least around where I live. So, gas prices are up. Inflation, I've covered that before, where that is still above, and higher. And it's probably going to go even more, get even higher than that, because he's starting to slap on some more tariffs. So when I was driving over here to tape the show, they were saying like 60 countries now he's going to start putting either additional tariffs or new ones on those countries. Again, like with this previous tariffs, I suspect somebody will file a lawsuit and ultimately it'll go up to the Supreme Court. God knows how long that'll take. And then they'll have to make some ruling on this series of tariffs. But in the meantime, until a judge tells them to stop, he's going to keep them in place. And if a judge does tell him to stop, doesn't mean he's going to. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a later segment today. So, these numbers are bad. So I look back at, what were George W. Bush's numbers and Obama's numbers at this time in their second term, or the same time frame? Bush was negative 20. So this was, during the time of the Iraq War that, he lied us into. And then Obama was at negative 8. When you compared the two averages of the CNBC and the Washington Post poll, that's the word those numbers were. When you do that for Trump, he's at a negative 22. So he's beat out George Bush for the worst this century. And I look back for Bush. When he had these numbers, I look back at the midterms there, and the Democrats ended up winning the House back at that point in time too. So this was in 2006. The Democrats ended up winning the House 233 to 202. So Trump's numbers are worse than that, and they probably are going to be worse or get worse by November. So, even with all their gerrymandering and trying to rig the elections, hopefully the Democrats again get out there and vote, take back the House, and hopefully take back the Senate. I still think we can do that if enough of us vote. So make plans to do that, and all your friends around the country. So I've talked before about how in a lot of these elections, independents determine the outcomes ultimately in many elections, because the Democrats are going to vote for the Democratic candidate, the Republicans are going to vote for the Republican candidate, for the most part. So what about independents? Well, George Bush was at negative 31, at this time in his second term. Richard Nixon, and this was during Watergate, was at negative 37 with independents. Guess what Trump's numbers are? Minus 45 with independents right now. So this is a new record again. Trump, he loves records. Well, he's setting them now. And I suspect he will continue to do it. So I looked at another a poll. So this is from the American Research Group. Did a recent poll. They polled adults, just adults in general, for Mango Mussolini's approval rating. So they did adults, and then they also did a separate poll where they did registered voters. In other words, people who are, more likely to vote because they're registered now. Right? So so this one for adults in general. Again, this is a July poll. The disapproval for Trump was at 67%. His approval rating was at 30%. So here again, his net approval is minus 37 with just adults in general. Now, for registered voters, it was almost the same. So disapproval rating was still 67%, which is basically 2/3 of the adults don't like what he's doing. And his approval was 31%. So that was 1% more than the adults in general. So again, this is for registered voters, 31%. So his net is still negative 36% approval rating. Right, and I think, by the time November rolls around, you're gonna see his approval numbers only in the 20s, 20%. So that negative or that disapproval might get into the 40s, for net. So there's another poll that came out with some bad numbers for Trump. But of course, the Republican cult is still there. Right. So there was another poll about just the party. So right now, at this time in their second terms again, Bush's approval rating in the Republican Party was 78%. Obama's was 76%. And Trump's is 83%. So this just shows you how deluded Republicans are. Right? They're still going with this guy, considering how bad things are, but they're still supporting him by 83%. So, if you, keep it up. I mean, yeah, the hardcore Republicans might go along with this, but I don't know that that's going to help you out in the elections. It's not going to help you outside the cult. But one good news, even though it's 83, it was up in the 90. It was over 90% earlier. So that 83% number is actually a drop from his approval rating with his own party. So, if that trend continues, that'll be a good thing. So, based on these numbers, you can see why the Republicans are trying so hard to steal the midterm elections. They know their numbers are bad, so they got to rig the election somehow. This is why they're doing their, gerrymandering. This is why they're screwing around with mail-in votes. This is why they're threatening to have, ICE agents at, polling places, and all kinds of other things that they're going to try and do to cheat. Because that's the only way that they're going to win. Now, their latest thing that I've been noticing a lot when listening to some of their, comments to the press and everything is they've done some pivoting to basically calling the Democrats communists, right? So they're going to keep doing that until the election as well. Hoping that people will, by calling the Democrats communists, that, they'll make people more afraid of the Democrats than they are of the Republicans. Even if they don't like the Republicans, Republicans are part of their strategy is going to be, well, we're better than the Democrats. You can, you hate the Democrats more than you hate us, so vote for us, kind of a thing, right? That's what they're going to be doing. And this whole commie thing is, part of that strategy. Now, the problem is I don't think that's going to work. It might work with older people, but I think, the younger generations just aren't buying that anymore. But, go ahead and try, Republicans. Go ahead. That's your big strategy. Because, you don't have any policies or any laws that you pass to help the working people. So you're just going to do the scaremongering stuff. That's your plan. So the only bill of consequence that's passed so far was the big horrible bill. And I've talked about that on a number of shows about how bad that is for the average person. Now, it's great for the rich people, but not for the rest of us. Well, now in the House, they passed a new um, bill where farmers are going to, assuming this passes in the Senate, which I'm not so sure it's going to, but they put some socialism bailouts in there for farmers. So they're accusing the Democrats of being communists, but then the Republicans are being socialists by giving bailouts to farmers because they screwed over the farmers with these stupid tariffs. So they're going to give them a bailout. Now, as I've said on other shows, again, doesn't mean the average, mom and pop farmer is going to get the money. A lot of that's going to go to the corporate farmers, right? So, but that's basically the only thing that they've done is the big horrible bill as far as passing any policy. Now they're still trying to pass the SAVE Act as far as knocking people off so they can't vote. They're still going to try and do that because again they're trying to cheat to win, and that's the only strategy that they got. But in that bill that I'll talk about here in just a minute, they're giving Mango Mussolini another $70-some billion for his war in Iran. Even though we supposedly kicked their ass and knocked out their military and all that weeks ago, but yet we got to spend, $70+ billion more for this unending war where they have no strategy at all. And they're going to try and do this by reconciliation process so that they can pass it without any Democrats voting for it and to try and avoid the filibuster in the Senate. So the House passed this thing 216 to 214, where at least the proposal that they passed, $73 billion is to the military, $12 billion is to the farmer bailout, and then $10 billion is to, as they call it, election integrity, which is basically election rigging, election cheating type of things. So $10 billion of your money is going to try and cheat in the elections. So that whole business with the SAVE Act, though, because that was part of this bill too, I suspect the Senate parliamentarian is going to throw that out and say you can't put that in a reconciliation. They've tried to do this before and it didn't go anywhere in the Senate, so I don't see anything really changing there. But you never know. Republican senators might look at the numbers and go, yeah, the only way we can win is cheat. So they may do it. So, the House here passed $95 billion more. And by the way, I'll talk about this in a later segment too. The party that claims they're so fiscally responsible, this $95 billion is going to be borrowed money. It's going to add to the debt. It's all going to be deficit spending. So the debt keeps growing more and more and more as Republicans have control of the government, like we talked about before. So, what's another? I'll round up 5 more billion. What's another 100 billion? So I looked up the latest national debt number, 39.6 trillion. So it won't be long till we hit 40, if this spending keeps up. And since Trump took over in January 2025, the national debt's gone up 3.5 trillion. So that's a lot in a year and a half. And, he's going to add to it if this thing passes. And of course, he's adding tariffs on Canada, which of course is not, Canada is our leading trading partner. So he's going to be slapping on more tariffs. That's not going to help us. That's going to piss off Canadians even more than they already are. And then finally, I saw Fox Lies has a poll out covering all kinds of things. I'm not covering all of them here in my what's left here, but I just wanted to point out some of the top issues that they had in their polling. So they polled registered voters on, so here's a bunch of issues that they polled. On income inequality, those people favored the Democrats by 60 to 38%. On healthcare, they favored the Democrats 60 to 39%. On inflation and prices, they favored the Democrats 54 to 44%. On the economy, Democrats were favored 54 to 45%. On foreign policy, the Democrats were favored 53 to 46%. On government spending, Democrats were favored 51 to 48%. I was getting a little closer. But still, you remember, this is Fox Lies poll here. Immigration. That was the big thing Trump ran on. Democrats are favored 50 to 49% now. So that one's pretty tight. But I'm starting to see more polls with the same kind of results where people don't like what the Republicans are doing with immigration, so they're starting to favor the Democrats now. It didn't used to be that way, of course, but it's at least, tied, or in this case, Democrats have a 1% edge. Yeah, the Republicans did win a couple. National security, 50 to 48%. So, I mean, that's even 2% difference. That's pretty tight. And then they also won crime, 53 to 46%, which is kind of weird because they're the ones out there doing all the criming. ICE is out there breaking all kinds of laws. Republicans are pardoning all these criminals. But, again, this is a Fox Lies poll. So I'm not really surprised about that. So, and on their Trump approval rating, it's only 39%. So he is still, so just for him now, negative 15 on immigration for approval ratings, minus 32 on Iran, minus 34 on the economy, and minus 46, ouch, minus 46 on inflation, which again, I think is going to keep going up. So they even did, well, what about motivation to vote? Democrats are ahead 68 to 57 for being extremely motivated compared to the Republicans. Generic House district, Democrats are leading 53 to 46 over Republicans. In areas where Trump beat Harris by 10 points or less, Democrats are leading 59 to 41%. So again, polls are looking good for the Democrats, but again, they're just polls. They don't mean much other than, well, yeah, the polls look good, but you can't get comfortable, Democrats. You got to keep pushing, and you got to get people out there voting. All right, we're going to take our first break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about Walmart and Amazon and how they are taking advantage of the government and our system and our tax dollars. Talk about that next here on Politics Matter Show. Back to the Politics Matter Show, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. All right, let's talk about Amazon and Walmart and some just big businesses in general. Now, I've talked about this a little bit before about how part of their business plan is actually, we're going to pay you crappy wages so that you can get on food stamps and health, like Medicaid, because you're poor. Or we're only going to give you a part-time job, so we don't have to give you any health care benefits or any other benefits. Right? This is how they work, and they're getting like record profits, right? Well, basically that means that we, the taxpayers, are subsidizing their employers, and ultimately they get to keep more money, and they are, making all these record profits because they're too cheap to pay higher wages and give better benefits. So I noticed, and I didn't read it word by word, but I did read some summaries of a recent Government Accountability Office report that found that a growing number of Amazon and gig economy workers earn so little that they qualify for these government benefits. I mean, and the number keeps getting higher and higher and higher. So, for example, the number of Amazon employees receiving food stamps and Medicaid in September of 2025. So they basically were looking at last year in this study. Those numbers nearly tripled since their 2020 report. Right. So in about 5 years, or a little more than 5 years period of time, for Amazon employees, people getting food stamps and Medicaid nearly tripled. And you keep hearing Amazon, especially because there's some places here in the cities, some of those warehouses where we pay and all this great money and all that. Well, food stamps and Medicaid employees nearly tripled in 2025. Meanwhile, rideshare and food delivery companies are now among the top employers who, their employees are getting these government benefits like Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Grubhub, and Instacart. So this particular study looked at 11 states. And in those 11 states makes up about 20% of the American people. So about a fifth of the people in the country. Guess which other company workers were receiving a lot of these benefits? Well, that would be Walmart, notoriously. They're always on the top of this list. And FedEx now is inching up there. So here we have companies that make more than $1 billion in profit, having a chunk of their employees in poverty. Because to get food stamps and get Medicaid, you basically got to be in poverty under the federal poverty guidelines. Now, there was Amazon was contacted to get some input from them. They basically said, well, these numbers are wrong. And they also said, well, we have a lot of part-time workers, so that's going to skew these numbers too. Meaning, because they're part-time workers, they don't have to pay as much, nor do they have to give them any benefits. So yeah, you see this all the time where they won't offer full-time jobs, so they can avoid this. They just offer a bunch of part-time jobs, so they don't have to pay them as much, so they get to keep more money. So in 2024, there were nearly 14 million adults who worked at some point that year that received Medicaid. And 10.6 million got food stamps. So, this is a common misconception, especially by Republicans. And they say this all the time. It's like, all those people getting that money, they're not working. Yeah, a lot of them are. They're just getting paid crap. So in 2024, nearly 14 million adults who were on Medicaid, who qualified for Medicaid, were working. And 10.6 million people working got food stamps because they didn't make enough money. And a lot of those people work full-time, by the way. I've talked about that before with minimum wage jobs and low-paying jobs. But when the work requirement for the, big horrible bill kicks in, which is, some of them already have in some states, because some states already passed the same requirements. But the big ones are going to start kicking in next year after the elections. Millions more people are going to lose their benefits. So, groups have looked at some of the states that have already had these work requirements. And, in the end, more people drop off because they don't want to, they can't deal with the paperwork. They don't understand the paperwork, right? That kind of stuff. So they just eventually they just give up and say it isn't worth it. Which is the point. This is what the Republicans want. This is how they want to kick people off of these programs, is make the paperwork so onerous on a lot of people that they just give up. So when the big horrible bill work requirements kicked in, people are going to have to be required to work, volunteer, go to school, or enroll in job training programs for 80 hours per month, or they're going to get kicked off the program. Now, there was a reason why there's never been a work requirement at the federal level until now. That's because, you don't want to kick off a bunch of people that qualify for the program. Well, this is a way to do it. And of course, Republicans, when they were debating this bill, just lied about what's going to happen here. But, that's the point. This is a backhanded way to kick poor people off the programs so that they can give that money to the rich people for their tax breaks that they gave them in the big horrible bill. Speaking of SNAP, I've discussed previously about how there's already 4.5 million people kicked off of SNAP because of new eligibility requirements. 1.5 million of those are children. So yeah, let's starve some more children. That's something the Democrats should put in their ads against the Republicans. Republicans want to starve kids. Well, 1.5 million of them at least, and that number's going to grow. So I wonder how many Republican voters are going to, how they're going to react when they lose their benefits or their kid loses their benefits. Are they still going to vote for the Republicans? Probably, as I talked about in a previous show. But, hopefully this will get some of them to change their mind. Plus, again, starting October of 2027, this is when a lot of these, some of these benefits kick in January of 2027. But in October of 2027, this is when states now are going to have to pay part of the benefits so that the feds aren't going to have to pay that percentage. And this is based off of your state's error rates on these programs. But now, poor states like the Republican poor states in the South, you think they got millions of dollars money sitting around that they're going to send into the feds? No. Here's what's going to happen. They're just going to say, we're just not going to do SNAP. Or we're only going to do, so many. That's all we can do. That's all the workers we got. We can't do any more than this. Or they're going to reduce the benefits, or they're going to try and do something. But some of them are just going to say, it ain't worth it. We're not going to do it. Good luck. The cruelty is the point, as I've said before, right? So Republicans, they love to say, we're going to save all this money for the government by kicking these people off the programs. Well, how about we take a look at how the Republicans are blowing our money on stupid things that hurts us, the average person, but, helps the rich people, which is what Republicans do. So, this should not be shocking, but this is what they do. So let's start with those Washington, D.C. projects that Mango Mussolini is doing. So far, $14.7 million for that stupid reflecting pool that he didn't need to do. And it still ain't fixed. So that number's going to get higher. Who can forget the 2025 military parade he gave for himself? That cost us $45 million. How about tearing down the east wing of the White House and putting, he wants to put in some golden ballroom. Well, so far that's $307 million. And that's for security. Now, you watch. They're going to try and get us to pay a chunk of that money, the construction money, for the actual construction of the ballroom. That's going to come up at some point. So that's good. That number's probably going to go up even more. And then how about the Kennedy Center redesign? That cost us $257 million. How's that doing now? Well, at least they tore his name off of it. But, you add all those numbers together, just those few numbers I've listed here, that's $624 million plus. That's gone down the drain for Trump's vanity projects that the Republican Party is just going along with. What could we spend $624 million on? Well, there's a lot of things. But, we're just pissing it away now. What about that border wall with Mexico, right? Mexico's not paying for it. Well, we are. So the amount appropriated through fiscal year 2029 is $46.5 billion. And the ICE has gotten an additional $113 plus billion to run around and scoop people up off the streets. And in many cases, wrongly scooping up the people. But they don't care about that. What about other immigration costs, like immigration judges and transportation for getting people to detention centers and into court and all that sort of stuff, right? That all costs money too. That's $49+ billion through 2029. So when you add up these immigration costs, that's another 207+ billion with a B, $1 billion that we're wasting. And for the people who are saying, well, we're deporting all kinds of people, I'll spend my money on that. Well, just remember that Obama and Biden deported more people than Trump is. So, as I've said before, your whole argument on this just falls. But, you don't care about facts. You're deporting less people, you're spending all this god-awful money, and you're still deporting less people. Well, we don't have open borders. Well, yeah, there's probably less people coming over the border, but there's, the inflation rate's going up. Gas prices are going up. And oh, by the way, the business community is complaining because they don't have enough workers because you're deporting too many of them. Or too many of them are scared they're going to get deported, so they're not coming to work. So, as I said before, Trump's approval rating on immigration is now like around -18. When he started his second term, it was +7. So now he's dropped 25 points. Well, how about, something you might not know is canceled energy project costs. So here's what happened when Biden was president. The Democrats passed a law where they're doing a lot of solar projects and wind projects and water, projects and, renewable energy type of stuff. Well, the Trump administration canceled all that stuff. And they paid the people when they canceled the stuff so that, they couldn't be sued for breach of contract. Right? So they paid off the contractors for not doing these jobs. So these business people are getting paid not to do the job. Well, we paid $2.5 billion just for canceled wind project leases. Down the drain. So, we're talking about over $583 billion plus. When you look at the numbers that I gave you here, plus if you take into account some of the numbers on tariff, the war in Iran and, those sorts of costs too. So when you add that all together, the average, or the household cost is $4,325 per household that we are paying for all this crap that's getting us nothing. But yet we're supposed to believe that the Republicans are fiscally responsible and fiscally conservative and all this stuff. And this is just 18 months, right? We still got a long time to go in the second term. So some of these numbers are just going to keep going up and up and up. So, this whole argument by the Republicans about, we like small government and we like fiscally responsible people. No, they're not. They're giving a blank check to a fascist regime to fight a war that has no end in sight. They're giving a blank check to ICE to just go around and kill people in the streets, scoop up people wrongly, deport them, deport citizens. I mean, they've done that. All the while driving up the national debt number. So that national debt number is going to hit $40 trillion sooner rather than later, assuming that this keeps up. All right, we're going to take our second break here, and make sure you stick around for the third segment because I'm going to be talking about Mikey J, as I call him, Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House. So we'll talk about that on the other side of the break here on Politics Matters. right, welcome back to the Politics Matter Show. So, Brett tells me I have just under 8 minutes to do this segment, so I'm not going to be able to get through all the criticism I have for Mikey Johnson, Speaker of the House, but, I can talk about it some more some other time on another show. So, the reason I bring him up is I heard him, talk. He gave a presser the other day, and I got a good laugh out of it because of some of the stuff that he was talking about when he is talking about, well, this is what the Republican Party stands for. So here's what he said. So I'm quoting him now. It's individual freedom, limited government, the rule of law, peace through strength, fiscal responsibility, free markets, and human dignity, close quote. So I got a good laugh out of that when I heard that because, all of these things is like, no, he just lied his ass off as he does a lot. Where, no, none of these. I mean, he says he lies with a straight face, as a lot of, politicians do. So let's look at some of these items. Again, I won't have enough time to get through all of them, but I'll just go through what I can get through here. So, let's see if these, the items that he's listed here are what today's Republican Party fits in any of these. And, spoiler alert, they don't. So let's start with individual freedom. Well, it's easy to bust that myth because many individuals don't have freedom under this fascist regime in power right now. So, for example, and there's a lot more groups than I'm bringing up here, for sure. But women don't have freedom, individual freedom, especially in states that ban abortions. Some women have died because they couldn't get abortions. In some states, people don't get hired because they're pregnant, right? Or the company thinks, well, once they have a child, they're going to, want all this time off, and we can't do that, so they don't hire them for those reasons too. LGBTQ plus people, well, if you just pay attention to some of the stuff that's going on today, they're sure not getting any sort of individual freedom. They're getting less and less of it. Republicans are, blaming them for all their problems, especially trans people. Right? Trans women playing in girls' sports. Oh, the horror, right? We can't have that. Mikey Johnson and many Republicans are, if they're being honest, a lot of them are still against gay marriage. They're still against spousal rights for gay couples. And they're out there running around, oh, we got to have more kids. Please have more kids. Well, unless you're gay. We don't want you people to have more kids. So, they think there's this vast conspiracy going on to turn all kids gay or turn all kids trans. They say it in so many different ways. Well, what about immigrants? Especially if you're an undocumented immigrant. Well, you can literally in this country get killed by your own government, as we've seen with Renee Good and Alex Preddy, and now there's been others. Or you get deported somewhere where you're going to get killed. Or you're an immigrant you are a citizen, you're a legal citizen in the United States, and they deport you anyway. You get assaulted by ICE, or you get your car rammed, or your property damaged. This isn't individual freedom for them, Mike. How about being a liberal, on a liberal watch list? So, by the way, there was maybe you haven't heard about this, and there's a presidential memorandum about if the government thinks you are anti-capitalist or anti-fascist or you're not Christian enough for them, you might get put on a watch list or you might get arrested. Mikey, what about the people protesting against Israel? People got ran out of the country for that. Where's their individual freedom? And the party of limited government. Republicans have their claws in our everyday life in all kinds of ways. And they're doing it more. That's what, part of what the push is for these data centers and AI is they're going to do more surveillance on us. And we're being taped by more, cameras than ever before. ICE is roaming the streets, killing people, assaulting people, violating our rights with no accountability. Where's the limited government there? That they're just increasing the size of government with that. Right. And then the government, of course, they cover up what ICE is doing, or they don't cooperate with the states like they, didn't do initially with Good and Pretty. Women don't have autonomy over their own bodies, and they got like the abortion police running around in a lot of these states. And women have died because of this. And the doctors won't do anything because they're too afraid they're going to get charged with a felony in these states. And of course, who can forget all the book bans by the government and the government telling teachers what they can and can't teach in their classes, or what art or posters they have to put up. And in some states, you have to do the 10 Commandments, and other religious Christian things in your schools. That's not limited government. That's definitely a more intrusive government. The rule of law. So this might be the last one given my time here. But really, you're out there claiming the Republican Party is for the rule of law. Oh boy. Well, let's see. Republicans on the Supreme Court gave presidential immunity for crimes while in office. Yeah, that's really rule of law. Trump pardoning over 1,500 January 6ers. Yeah, that's definitely rule of law there. Trump pardoning drug lords. Trump pardoning pedophiles and fraudsters. Yeah, that's following the rule of law, Mikey. Arresting people with no probable cause or no due process. And not following court orders. And by the way, Mikey, where are those Epstein files? You're supposed to be, the regime is supposed to be turning over all those things. No, you're not doing that. You're not following the rule of law. Not to mention all the war crimes I've talked about before on this show, blowing up all these boats. By the way, now the body count is now over 210 that they've killed. So that's over 210 war crimes. Not to mention the bombing of a kid's school in Iran. You're bombing civilians in Iran. You're bombing water supplies, which is another war crime. And now they've decided they're not going to report deaths in ICE detention facilities anymore. And the Department of Justice is going after political enemies. Yeah, Republicans are not for the rule of law. All right, have a good weekend. We will talk to you next week.